You were looking at Sigmund Freud's actual office and the original psychiatric couch. The reason we're looking at that is because laying down on the shrink's couch and talking about your dream is how this song begins and kind of the mechanism that it revolves around. The song is absolutely brilliant and I think really underrated in Dylan's canon. It's an epic song. It actually has more words in it than any other song on the Freewheelin', including Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. It's 71 lines across 12 stanzas, so quite a bit that he packs in here, and that's because it's a big subject. Basically, the end of the world through nuclear annihilation, World War III. And it's worth remembering Dylan was part of the first generation to be raised under the specter of that. Now, he had tackled this subject matter earlier, some would say earlier on this album, with The Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, but even earlier than that as a songwriter, with this song here, Let Me Die in My Footsteps. This time, however, he takes a very unexpected approach to a very grim subject. I'm not even showing the entire person here because it's too disturbing, but this is one of the victims of one of the 2 atomic bombs dropped in World War II. The character in Dylan's song is talking to a psychiatrist because he had a dream about World War III. You're looking at a fallout shelter piece of literature, and I've got a lot of them in this video. And these are the kinds of things that Dylan and the character in the song are obsessed with, but the direction he takes, the way he attacks the subject, is not what we'd expect. So we have a very comic opening to a very tragio-comic song. Some time ago, a crazy dream came to me. I dreamt I was walking into World War III. I'm not going to read all of the lyrics, or this video would be 30 minutes. Start of the next stanza says, I said, hold it, Doc. A world war passed through my brain. He said, nurse, get your pad. This boy's insane. In Dylan's Visions of Sin, Sir Christopher Ricks highlights the use of the word pad there. But you should buy his book and read it. What I want to point out is that this is the start of the subtle brilliance and complexity of this song. It's easy to take the song as maybe just a lark, but the absurdity of the times is, I think, reflected by the absurdity of the situation in the song. Something this picture does as well, and it shows this confluence of kind of 50s sunny advertising, TV culture, consumer culture, the burgeoning consumer culture that started after World War II, with the specter of nuclear annihilation. Dylan has a lot of fun with that in this song, and I think that's probably been overlooked. So let's move on to the next stanza. Now we get to the dream sequence in the song as Dylan describes it for the psychiatrist. I was down in the sewer with some little lover when I peeked out of the manhole cover. Kind of interesting that sex makes it into a song about nuclear annihilation, and if you notice, it makes it into a lot of these bomb shelter advertisements. I think that ties back to what we said about the consumerism and flashiness in advertising meeting with this fear of that. When I peeked out from a manhole cover, wondering who turned the lights on, this is the light in question. And I'll be honest, I listened to this song countless times before I actually realized that. Again, think how bizarre the song is relative to the subject matter. Dylan's having a romantic tryst in the sewer, and that's why he is spared from the atomic blast. Let's do this whole stanza because I think it really captures the ambiance of the song. Well, I got up and walked around, up and down the lonesome town. I stood a-wonderin' which way to go. I lit a cigarette on a parking meter and walked on down the road. It was a normal day. I love how detached that is, and I think that plays into some of the satire and observations that he's baked into the song. He's this Candide-like character, just wandering around in his innocence. So in that innocence, he's walking down this, presumably deserted street because, the bomb went off. And the line that a lot of people have latched onto over the decades is, I lit a cigarette on a parking meter and walked on down the road. Well, how do you light a cigarette on a parking meter? If it's on fire because the entire city is, then that's how. Then again, he could just be referring to striking a match on a parking meter, and we'll never know. Either way, it captures the casual air of the song and the character, given the annihilation he's wandering around in. Isolation rhymes with alienation, and I think that's another theme of this song, and maybe one that's been a little bit overlooked. Dylan seems to find modern life alienating, right? It has this way of isolating us from each other, and his character, not only is he kind of unconcerned with what's happening, but he's unable to connect to other people, even when he finds them. And that's what each of the next 3 stanzas deal with. He shows up at a fallout shelter, essentially asks for some food, and is greeted with a shotgun blast. He has similar results with the next person he sees, out on the street. I'll read a little from this one. I said, howdy friend, I guess there's just us two. He screamed a bit, and away he flew. Thought I was a communist. He has something very different in mind with the next person he sees. Well, I spied a girl before she could leave. I said, let's go play Adam and Eve. I took her by the hand and my heart was thumping. She said, hey man, you crazy or something? You see what happened the last time they started. Yeah, a man-made apocalypse ended the world, so she seems to be saying the world is better off without humans on it, and thereby turning down the offer to help repopulate the Earth. Well, this technique of following Dylan's narrator, who's wandering around in a post-apocalyptic world, continues, and by the way, it's something he's used for decades. Well, I seen a Cadillac window uptown, and there was nobody around. I got into the driver's seat, and I drove down 42nd Street, in my Cadillac. Good car to drive after a war. I actually think this is conceptually brilliant, and again, because of that, underappreciated. The Cadillac defines American, consumer culture, conspicuous consumption in the post-World War II era. Dylan's character is presumably not a wealthy man before the, apocalypse, and now he can just jump into a Cadillac. The advertising of the time indicated that, material possessions would bring you happiness, right? Like the ultimate. What if you arrive, you end up as a Cadillac owner? I would argue Dylan, consciously or otherwise, realizes how ridiculous that is in light of a very possible apocalypse, a man-made apocalypse. Then on top of that, of course, it's human relationships that are going to bring you happiness and not material possessions. I think he wraps all of that into this critique. His character has consistently failed to connect to the few surviving human beings that he finds, but he can jump right into a Cadillac, and you can hear an extra jolt of joy in his voice, I think a sarcastic one, in the song at that line. In my Cadillac. Well, that's not a complete line, but anyway, then Good Car to Drive After a War absolutely puts its finger on everything we've been talking about in terms of the post-World War II era. The next stanza is great too, and it's built on a juxtaposition. There's the Conelrad radio, which he tries to listen to, but he can't because he didn't pay the bill, so he goes to his record player and escapes to music. The irony is that the Conelrad is what you would listen to in case of emergency and for instructions in something like, or maybe specifically, I couldn't figure it out, an atomic blast. So money comes into play even after the essentially end of the world, because he's not a member of the bourgeois who can afford to hang out in one of these fallout shelters stocked with food and whatnot, right? He doesn't have one of those to go to. He couldn't even afford to pay the bill that would let him listen to the radio to hear where he should go now. Well, one thing he can do is listen to music on his record player. Don't worry about where the electricity comes from, just for the sake of the song. He can, but it's a really flippant kind of music, right? So he seems to be poking fun at the 50s, early 60s, kind of innocence, rock and roll. And that, I think, is buttressed by the way he used this line live over and over again. He would kind of insert a new artist into that section. Fabian and people like that. Think about it, if it's a young Bob Dylan writing about surviving a nuclear war and playing a record, why wouldn't it be, a Woody Guthrie record or something? There are countless old blues and Americana songs that would actually fit the situation better. We have a really fun but also biting stanza now, and it's the final one for the dream sequence. So I called up the operator of time just to hear a voice of some kind. This might require a quick explanation for some people. In the old days, you could call up the operator, it's an automated line, and the recorded voice would just tell you what time it was. Remember, Dylan's character has been rebuffed by actual human beings at every turn, so now he's just listening to a pre-recorded voice repeat the time over and over again. When you hear the beep, it will be 3 o'clock. She said that for over an hour, and I hung up. So we're certainly back to the alienation theme, and it's interesting he has to reach out to technology to find some facsimile of human companionship. Ironic because technology is what just wiped most of the people off of the earth, and also it mirrors how he went to the record player. Again, kind of a solitary technological escape from the fact that he can't connect with people, and how prescient, because, he was just starting really the modern, postmodern American era, where of course people are doing that more and more. And the song has a great surprise in store, because now the doctor interrupts, thereby breaking the recounting of the dream, and it turns out he's been having the same dreams. And then to quote, "But mine was a little different, you see. I dreamt the only person left after the war was me." Next stanza continues that thought. Well, now time has passed, and now it seems everybody's having those dreams. Everybody sees themselves walking around with no one else. So Dylan paints this picture of the collective unconscious being fixated with the impending disaster. And until this conversation with the psychiatrist, everybody thought they were the only ones having that dream. And that's really a further continuation on the note of loneliness that the song is so much about. And I know I've said this kind of thing before, but this is what makes Dylan such a unique songwriter. Look at how he approaches this subject. He comes in from so many unexpected vectors, with humor, with this sub-theme, if you will, about loneliness, with this device of everyone in the world having the same dream about the war but not knowing it. The song started particularly humorously, and so it ends that way. Half of the people can be part right all of the time, Some of the people can be all right part of the time, but all of the people can't be all right all of the time. I think Abraham Lincoln said that. Absolutely hilarious, completely unexpected, and it sets up the final line, "I'll let you be in my dreams if I can be in yours." I said that. That's also quite funny, cleverly pulls in the dream concept of the whole song again. That adds a level of nuance, though, that we didn't think about, presumably, earlier in the song. Is each of the people he ran into during his dream someone who's experiencing their own dream at the same time? And if so, remember, they didn't really allow him to get to know them, so he's, imploring people to not separate themselves from their fellow man. And that's a lesson that could obviously apply to the pre-World War III present, and not just the future. Speaking of things you might not have noticed, this is the only stanza where he addresses the listener directly. Everything else was a story. As much as Dylan likes to pretend that he doesn't preach to his audience, pre-Christian conversion that is, he really does so here, and especially in the stanza, but he buries it under so much lightheartedness. Well, hopefully you can see why I think this song is grossly underrated. In one of the defining characteristics of his work, I think, it has this knack for being more interesting the more you think about it. For instance, we didn't really mention the title in terms of intent. Talkin' World War III Blues. Well, Talkin' Blues was a form of American roots music that Dylan was influenced by, and you always changed up the title, or usually, so you'd have Talkin' Dust Bowl Blues, or Talkin' Fishing Blues. Well, one of the first songs to deal with the reality of the nuclear bomb was this one here, Old Man Adam, or Talkin' Atomic Blues, which of course reminds us of Talkin' World War III Blues. Also, the song is quite funny. It's well worth listening to, and I'm going to have a link to it in the description for this video here. If it was in fact the inspiration for Dylan's song, then it's not one of those cases where he models his song on an older one. They sound nothing alike. And funny enough, I didn't really find anyone asking if that inspiration correlation exists. Seems like a really obvious question. Did Dylan get the idea for his song from this one? And while I do love Old Man Adam, it's great, it has none of the complexities that we just spent so much time talking about in Dylan's song. In fact, it should rate much higher in his catalog than it does. Thanks.